What if I told you the most civilized minds of Renaissance Europe, poets, kings, philosophers, spent centuries consuming the dead and called it medicine? Picture a candlelit salon, velvet curtains breathing with the draught silver spoons tapping fine crystal, and a bowl of gray-brown powder set at the center like a sacrament-ground mummy. They named it Mummia. They swore it cured pain plague, even time itself. If you dare to unseal what they did in the name of science, subscribe now, because the truth ahead is older than any tomb and darker than any myth. The fever began with wonder. Explorers brought back lotus-scented tales of Egypt, a kingdom that seemed to whisper across sand and millennia. Mummies were not merely relics. They were trophies that turned drawing rooms into museums and museums into theaters of the uncanny. In London, a shop window might display a linen-wrapped arm beside cinnamon and silk. In Paris, an antiquarian would smile as guests sipped wine and debated whether the wrappings hid a priest, a prince, or a curse. Prestige demanded proof, and nothing proved worldliness like owning the dead. The spark that lit the craze was a mistranslation, a mirage of medicine. Arabic texts praised mummia bituminous pitch used in treatments, yet European readers dazzled by the gloss of resin, and time mistook the word for the substance of mummies themselves. If pitch could preserve, they reasoned, then preserved flesh must be saturated with healing force. Thus the syllables shifted, and with them the ethics mummia became mummia. And pharmacies stocked jars of pulverized antiquity as if eternity could be decanted and sold by the ounce. Theory lent the habit a conscience. Physicians preached sympathetic medicine, the eerie notion that preserved tissue might transfer its permanence to living bodies. Swallow the dust of centuries and your bruise will fade, your fever still. Your life extend a little further into the dusk. The rhetoric felt modern, almost clinical: tinctures, plasters, syrups, drops. Underneath it beat an ancient hunger death, overcome by devouring death, an alchemy of hope no more logical than a prayer, and yet endorsed by the learned, recited in Latin, priced in gold. Soon the elegant and the ordinary alike consumed history by the spoonful. Apothecaries kept mummy beside myrrh next to fennel and frankincense labels written in careful hands for trembling customers. Artists crushed mummy brown on palettes, glazing shadows with the shade of embalmed kings. Even theaters echoed the habit, a line here, a rumor there, as if the stage itself inhaled the desert. Between faith and fashion, mummia became the answer to headaches, nosebleeds, melancholy, and the unspeakable ache of being mortal in a world that would not stop ending. But Europe's appetite outran Egypt's graves. Ships groaned with cargo no logbook dared to name. Bales of linen clinked with amulets. Sand drifted from ribs like sugar. Merchants learned to pack the past efficiently. Break a body here, a shoulder there. Nest skulls inside rib cages. Lace fingers between femurs until crates could carry a dozen lifetimes in a single voyage. Dockside, the air tasted of salt and resin as factors haggled. Priest or prince sate or Ptolemaic authenticity had a price, and the price taught men to counterfeit. When tombs thinned, the market adapted. Under moonlight behind hospitals and prisons, fresh corpses were lacquered in pitch, spiced with cedar, swaddled in linen, and sold as ancient. A counterfeit eternity warm enough to steam in winter carts entered drawing rooms as vintage. In narrow shops, millstones hummed. Iron teeth chewed bones to powder, while a clerk swept the counter with a camel hair brush, offering samples as if this were just tea. Meanwhile, pamphlets extolled grades, royal, priestly, common labels stuck to the dead as neatly as price tags. For the rich, ingestion became performance. Invitations arrived on embossed paper and unwrapping at 8, supper at 9. Guests sipped clove-stung wine while the host took up a surgeon's knife, part scholar, part magician. Linen unfurled in strips like pale rivers. Amulets glittered. Breath caught. Someone laughed too loudly. Afterward, small plates appeared, bread darkened with resinous dust, sweetmeats fortified with mummia, a cordial the color of old garnet. They toasted vitality with the dead, then asked the servants to sweep the floor of history. Not everyone applauded. A few voices, travelers, scholars, physicians with cleaner consciences called it barbarism, a desecration masquerading as cure. Their warnings arrived like letters buried in snow, correct, urgent, and easy to ignore. The fashion had answers ready. These were not people but specimens, not bodies but materia medica. Even prescriptions became anatomical riddles: skull for headaches, heart for palpitations, feet for foot pain, as if medicine could be mapped by sympathy alone. Dissent like incense vanished in the draft. Yet cracks formed in the theater's painted sky. Smugglers boasted in taverns. Fakers bragged of ripening fresh stock. Collectors compared notes and found too many queens with the same teeth. In laboratories lit by winter light, new thinkers asked heretical questions. Did any of this work? Where was the proof beyond profit and the placebo of prestige? And in the galleries of Europe, a subtler doubt took root. If these are people named mourned, imagined into eternity, what does it make us to grind them into hope? The answer was coming, and it would taste like ash. By the early 17th century, mummy had become a household word, a prescription as ordinary as honey or vinegar. Recipes circulated in medical textbooks, neat lines of Latin instructing how many grains to grind, how much wine to dilute. The bitter irony was invisible. What seemed orderly and rational was, in truth, desecration dressed as science. In a quiet pharmacy in Prague, a mother spooned a gray solution into her child's mouth, whispering a prayer. To her, she was giving medicine. To us, she was feeding him the remnants of a pharaoh's afterlife. Kings were not exempt from the hunger. Charles II of England, famed for his intellect and insatiable curiosity, kept a vial of king's drops at his side. The potion shimmered faintly, rumored to contain powdered skull and the extract of mummy flesh. He drank it with confidence, a monarch swallowing mortality, as if it could be tamed. Even Francis Bacon, philosopher of reason, spoke of mummy with reverence, as though truth itself might be coaxed from the dust of embalmed ancestors. It was not fringe, it was crown and court altar and academy. In candlelit halls of Paris, dinner tables bore more than delicacies. There were experiments in taste and terror. Guests nibbled bread mixed with mummy dust, laughed nervously as wine infused with resinous powder burned down their throats. It became a spectacle of sophistication who could claim the oldest vintage, the most exotic fragment. The rarest cut, aristocrats whispered boasts. This rib belonged to a priest of Amun. Another replied, "Mine a queen's thigh bone." They thought themselves refined. In truth, they were devouring history in small, perfumed bites. Artists, too, joined the silent feast. The pigment mummy brown colored countless canvases, lending portraits an earthy shadow. An observer might marvel at the depth of a noblewoman's eyes, unaware they stared through a glaze tinted by human remains. Painters argued over quality. Finer particles gave smoother tones, coarser grains yielded rough texture. Thus, the dead, once painted with hieroglyphs in golden tombs, returned centuries later to paint the faces of strangers who never knew their names. Art became another form of consumption, silent yet permanent. The demand pressed grave robbers into frantic work. Tombs, once guarded by jackals and sandstorms, fell to shovels and greed. Nights in Thebes and Giza rang with the crack of stone lids, the hiss of linen torn from bone. The Nile carried whispers of theft, but gold flowed too richly for silence to break. Local peasants, desperate for coin, joined the trade, their hands pulling ancestors from sacred soil. Ships at Alexandria brimmed with crates whose labels concealed the truth, not spice, not cloth, but the flesh of eternity. Inevitably, the trade decayed into fraud. Merchants in Cairo mixed resin with fresh corpses, producing counterfeit mummies that fooled even seasoned buyers. Executed criminals became ersatz pharaohs. Beggars' bodies were lacquered and sold as royal stock. The lie spread across Europe where few dared question the provenance of their powders. After all, the illusion was convenient. Whether genuine or false, the product sold. The parties continued and the patients swallowed their cures with desperate faith. Behind every glittering glass of mummy wine lay the silence of a body misnamed. For all its cruelty, the practice carried a logic born of fear. Europe reeled from plague, war, and famine. Death was a daily guest, its shadow long across alleys and palaces alike. Medicine was fragile, uncertain, built as much on tradition as on evidence. To believe in mumia was to grasp at hope, however macabre. A bruise might heal on its own, a fever might break, and patients credited the powder. The placebo became proof, the corpse became cure, and no one stopped to count the cost in bones. And so mummy feasts escalated. In the salons of France, hosts planned entire evenings around themed banquets. Guests arrived in silks, candles flared, and plates of delicacies appeared seasoned with powdered remains. Toasts were raised not only to health, but to immortality. Musicians played painters, mixed their pigments. Philosophers debated the ethics while sipping mummy-infused cordials. It was a masquerade of intellect, culture, and power, all orbiting around a secret horror. The deeper the deception, the more fashionable it became, as though civilization itself had chosen to dine on denial. Yet somewhere dissent smoldered. Travelers from the Arab world wrote of their disgust, branding the practice barbaric. Scholars began whispering doubts: if mummies were preserved by salt and resin, not pitch, then the entire medical foundation was a mistake. Grave robbers themselves confessed to fabrications. The glamour dimmed slightly, but still the hunger clung on. Too many reputations, too many fortunes, too many traditions rested on the lie. To admit error was to admit centuries of cannibalism disguised as culture. The Enlightenment, however, carried its own storm. As science demanded proof, the curtain began to tear. Laboratories tested remedies, physicians charted outcomes, and the miraculous powers of mumia shrank beneath observation. At the same time, archaeologists learned to read hieroglyphs, to see not objects, but persons in the wrappings, souls, who had prayed for eternity, not a prescription. The revelation landed like a hammer. Europe had not only consumed the dead, it had erased them. And as conscience stirred, shame followed thick as the dust that once filled chalices. By the mid-18th century, the glamour of mummy medicine began to rot. Physicians whispered that too many patients failed to recover, too many powders tasted of nothing more than chalk and mold. Merchants scrambled to defend their trade, insisting on premium imports, but the doubt was contagious. The illusion of immortality cracked, leaving behind a sour aftertaste, centuries of indulgence built on corpses that could no longer hide the stench of fraud. Still, the fascination with mummies did not vanish overnight. Collectors continued to buy whole bodies not to eat, but to display. Drawing rooms became miniature museums where visitors marveled at the linen-wrapped forms reclining in glass cases. The spectacle shifted from consumption to exhibition, yet the violence remained human beings uprooted from their graves to satisfy European appetites for wonder. If not eaten, they were unwrapped, stared at, or dismantled for souvenirs. Stories of mummy unwrapping parties grew more elaborate. Invitations promised not only dinner, but entertainment of the Orient. Guests gathered in candlelit chambers as hosts carefully slit ancient bandages, pulling back layers to reveal dried hands, preserved teeth, amulets pressed against brittle chests. Gasps turned to applause. The dead, who had prayed to be left intact for eternity, became living theater for people who could not hear their silence. What had once been a feast of the mouth became a feast of the eyes. Meanwhile, artists continued dipping brushes into mummy brown. The color carried prestige, a secret ingredient whispered among studios. Portraits glowed with the warm shadow of powdered flesh. Landscapes absorbed the burnt umber of ancient ribs. But critics noticed the irony: paint that preserved beauty was made from bodies destroyed. By the 19th century, the pigment's reputation had soured and tubes labeled mummy quietly disappeared from shelves. A final silence, but one stained on canvas forever. The tide of science rose steadily. Physicians cataloged medicines with new rigor testing and discarding what failed. Mumia, once prescribed for everything from nosebleeds to plague, found itself absent from respectable lists. Instead of powders from tombs, doctors turned to herbs, minerals, and the budding science of chemistry. The silence of laboratories spoke louder than centuries of superstition. There was no proof in dust, no cure in the corpse. Archaeology dealt the final blow. Scholars in Europe learned to decipher hieroglyphs, unlocking voices of the dead themselves. They read prayers carved on sarcophagi, hymns painted in tombs, names whispered across 3,000 years. Suddenly, the mummy was no longer a commodity, but a person once loved, once feared, once human. To grind them into powder became unthinkable, almost sacrilegious. Museums replaced pharmacies, curators replaced apothecaries. The same bodies that had once been sold by weight were now guarded by glass. Public opinion shifted with startling speed. What had once been a fashionable indulgence became an embarrassment. Aristocrats who had hosted mummy banquets now denied ever tasting the dust. Physicians who had prescribed the powder quietly revised their works. The craze that had lasted for centuries was buried under collective denial, as though silence could erase the memory of a whole civilization consumed. But the bones remembered, and so did history. The cost was staggering. By conservative estimates, hundreds of thousands of mummies were destroyed, an entire chapter of Egyptian heritage ground into ash for Europe's illusions. Tombs were emptied, lineages erased, art lost. Each dose of medicine, each pigment mixed on a brush. Each banquet toast carried away another irreplaceable piece of humanity. When conscience finally awoke, there was almost nothing left to save. What remained was guilt and lesson. The mummy craze revealed the danger of authority untested, of knowledge taken on faith, of fashion disguising horror. For centuries, Europe prided itself on reason and progress, yet indulged in a ritual as primitive and grotesque as any myth. The contradiction lay bare. Civilization can be barbarism with a mask, and science can be superstition with Latin labels. The mummy trade was not just a market, it was a mirror. Today, we look back with disbelief. How could kings and scholars have swallowed ground flesh and called it cure? Yet the story warns us certainty is fragile, and every age has its mumia, its miracle fad cloaked in authority. The lesson is not only do not eat mummies, though that much is obvious. It is question what everyone seems to know, because history is full of people who believed dust could defeat death and left only dust behind. In the aftermath of this revelation, Europe began to reshape its relationship with antiquity. No longer were mummies ingredients or novelties. They became symbols of a lost grandeur that demanded reverence. Museums erected solemn halls where embalmed kings lay in cases under dim light. Visitors tiptoed past as though afraid their breath might disturb the silence of millennia. It was a new kind of theater this time, not feasting but remembering. Yet even in this shift, contradictions lingered. The same societies that now condemned the eating of mummies had only recently turned their bones to dust without hesitation. The hypocrisy was heavy, but rarely spoken aloud. Instead, Europe wrapped its shame in marble galleries and academic lectures, disguising guilt as cultural pride. Behind every glass case lay an unspoken confession: we once devoured the very bodies we now protect. Egypt, meanwhile, was left scarred. Its tombs had been gutted, its history scattered across foreign shores. What remained was guarded fiercely, but the loss was immeasurable. Entire family lineages disappeared from record, entire burial sites vanished into European bellies and paintbrushes. Archaeologists cataloged what they could, but the ghosts of those consumed could never be counted. Their afterlife was stolen, transformed into medicine, pigment, and banquet. As the 19th century dawned, fascination with Egypt only grew, but in different form. Travelers sought the Nile artists, painted pyramids. Writers spun tales of curses and phantoms. Ironically, The more Europe romanticized Egypt, the more it forgot how brutally it had plundered it. Popular imagination turned to mystery and myth, while the reality of consumption faded into footnotes. A collective amnesia softened the horror, allowing admiration to replace remorse. Still, traces of the old appetite surfaced. Rumors whispered of private collections where fragments of mummies remained in jars treasured not as medicine, but as curiosities of a darker age. A few eccentric collectors clung to the powders, claiming their ancestors had sworn by them. They were relics of superstition, fading embers of a fire that had once burned across a continent. The mainstream had moved on, but the shadows remembered. For historians, the mummy trade became a case study in collective folly. How could entire generations of educated men and women embrace something so grotesque? The answer, scholars argued, lay in desperation. In an age of plague and uncertainty, when medicine was guesswork and death was constant hope itself, was the drug. Mumia was less about efficacy than about faith. Faith that the past might lend its permanence to the fragile present. The lesson cut deeper than medicine. It revealed how easily authority can sanctify horror. When doctors prescribed mumia, when kings endorsed it, when philosophers praised it, the practice became untouchable. Few dared to question, fewer still dared to resist. It was proof that cruelty, when spoken in the language of science and culture, could parade as wisdom. And once belief hardened into tradition, it became nearly impossible to break. The echoes of this folly reach into the modern age. Today, miracle cures still circulate cloaked in the authority of experts or the glamour of fashion. Social media spreads them faster than any ship could sail. The mummy trade reminds us that consensus is not truth, and popularity is not proof. What seems obvious to one century can appear monstrous to the next. Skepticism is not cynicism, it is survival. And so the mummies once consumed now consume our conscience. Their absence haunts the museums, their dust lingers in the footnotes of history. Each missing body is a reminder of how curiosity, greed, and fear can conspire to erase entire legacies. They cannot speak for themselves, but their silence testifies louder than any lecture. We study them now, not to heal our bodies, but to heal our memory. Above all, this chapter teaches humility. Europe once believed it had mastered life and death by swallowing Egypt's dead. In truth, it revealed its own fragility and arrogance. The irony is brutal in trying to borrow eternity. Europeans destroyed it. Today we walk among the remnants, fragments behind glass pigments in paintings. And we must remember, not just the bodies consumed, but the warning they carry. Knowledge without wisdom can turn civilization into cannibal of its own ideals. In the quiet libraries of Europe, archivists began stumbling upon old prescriptions, yellowed pages that once instructed patients to swallow ground bones. The words read like incantations from a nightmare. Take 2 scruples of mummy powder for bleeding of the lungs. Scholars shuddered at the casualness, the normalization of a practice so obscene. These dusty manuals were not curiosities, they were proof of how deep the belief had sunk into daily life. Artists, too, left traces of the forgotten feast. Paintings in private collections revealed subtle browns and shadows that whispered of their origin. Conservators years later would analyze pigments and discover human tissue ground into paint. The revelation shocked modern audiences. Portraits of nobility, saints, and even children bore the flesh of Egyptians long gone. The paradox was chilling. Art meant to immortalize the living had been built upon the destruction of the dead. The more scholars uncovered, the more surreal it became. Diaries described social gatherings where mummy unwrappings drew more excitement than a royal masquerade. Some accounts spoke of children invited to watch, their eyes wide as linen fell away and shriveled faces appeared. For those children, death was no abstract idea. It was a parlor game. Their laughter, recorded in margins, now sounds like an echo from a civilization unmoored from empathy. Even the language of the trade betrayed its horror. Advertisements listed fine mummy, common mummy, or royal mummy, as though they were spices or grades of wine. Merchants argued over quality. A darker resin meant stronger medicine. Lighter tones suggested purity. Entire markets flourished on these classifications, turning the sacred remains of ancient people into commodities no different from cinnamon pepper or silk. Human history, priced and packaged, became just another line in the ledger. Yet amid the grotesque commerce, there were flickers of doubt. An Arabic physician named Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi wrote centuries earlier of his revulsion at Europeans eating mummies. His words, ignored then, now resurface with prophetic clarity. This practice is unworthy of civilized men. Few listened in his day, but his warning now resonates as the voice of conscience, long buried beneath greed. It shows that not everyone was blind. Some recognized barbarism even when wrapped in velvet. By the late 18th century, the scandal of counterfeits further eroded faith. Smugglers confessed that many so-called ancient mummies were mere weeks old, stolen from hospitals and execution grounds. The revelation horrified collectors who had paid fortunes for royal relics. Imagine their shame upon learning they had toasted immortality with the dust of criminals hanged the week before. The aura of mystique shattered, replaced by suspicion and ridicule. Science, too, marched forward. Experiments in anatomy and chemistry dismantled the myth of sympathetic medicine. The idea that preserved tissue could heal the living crumbled under the weight of evidence. Doctors began to abandon the practice, embarrassed by its lack of results. What had once been taught with certainty was now disowned, a relic of ignorance best forgotten. Yet forgetting came at the cost of truth, countless bodies already lost, countless stories erased. The 19th century cemented the transformation. Archaeology emerged as a discipline devoted to preservation, not consumption. Mummies were placed behind glass, catalogued with names, dynasties, and prayers painstakingly reconstructed. The same Europe that had once feasted upon them now declared itself their protector. It was a convenient reversal, one that obscured centuries of desecration. Yet for the first time, the dead were granted dignity instead of destruction. Public fascination persisted, but in altered form. Tourists gazed at mummies with awe. Writers spun tales of curses, and Egyptomania swept through architecture and fashion. The macabre feasts were gone, replaced by museums and novels. Still, the shadow of the past lingered. Every sarcophagus displayed under glass carried the ghost of those that had been ground into nothing. The absence was as haunting as the presence. And so the story of mummy consumption slipped into obscurity, remembered only by historians and the occasional sensational rumor. Europe preferred to celebrate its progress rather than confess its crimes. Yet beneath the marble halls and scholarly lectures, the truth waits. It reminds us that civilization is not a steady climb, but a wavering path, one where fear and arrogance can lead even the wisest into grotesque mistakes. The mummies may lie silent, but their silence is a warning carved deeper than stone. Whispers of the mummy trade still surface in the archives, tucked between shipping manifests and private letters. A merchant in Venice once bragged of a cargo more valuable than spice, a phrase that masked the reality: bodies wrapped in resin and linen, stacked like bales of wool. To him, they were profit. To us, they are evidence of how easily the human form can be stripped of identity when gold blinds the conscience. The Catholic Church, too, played a paradoxical role. While some clergy denounced the practice as sacrilege, others quietly endorsed it, prescribing mummia for ailments among their congregations. In sermons, priests extolled the virtues of relics, yet failed to distinguish between sacred relics and desecrated bodies. The hypocrisy blurred the line between veneration and consumption. Faith meant to sanctify life instead helped sanctify the devouring of the dead. Royal courts buzzed with gossip about the curative powers of mummia. A queen whispered of headaches, soothed by mummy wine. A prince praised the quick healing of bruises rubbed with powdered flesh. Courtiers competed for the rarest specimens, each vial a status symbol as much as a remedy. The irony was cruel. The wealthiest who feared death least consumed the dead, the most proof that even palaces were not immune to superstition. Meanwhile, ordinary households used mummy in humbler ways. Apothecaries sold packets cheaply, and mothers mixed it with honey for coughs or sprinkled it on wounds. In the alleys of Paris, a laborer might sip diluted mummy powder before returning to work, believing it gave him strength. For him, there was no banquet, no spectacle, only the hope that swallowing dust might ease the ache of survival in a harsh world. Travelers who witnessed the trade often recorded their horror. A German scholar described stumbling upon a bizarre stall where powdered mummy was sold beside cinnamon and cloves. The mingled scents of spice and death made him nauseous. He noted how casually customers haggled over handfuls of human dust as though buying flour. His words, written in a shaky hand, read less like observation and more like confession. He had looked into Europe's soul and seen rot. Even the language of healing could not disguise the violence. Prescriptions instructed patients to take the head for headaches, the heart for palpitations, the feet for gout. Each ailment matched to a body part, as though the human frame were nothing but a cabinet of spare parts. The absurdity went unnoticed then, but to us it reads like grim satire. Medicine turned into ritual cannibalism dressed in the robes of science. Over time, the contradictions piled too high. Scholars compared notes, travelers shared accounts, and skeptics raised louder questions. If mummies were truly miraculous, why did sickness still ravage Europe? If the powder preserved life, why did patients still die in droves? The questions festered until belief began to crumble. What had once seemed like certainty dissolved into embarrassment, leaving only silence and denial. As the Enlightenment spread, so did shame. Doctors quietly erased mumia from their texts, replacing it with herbs and minerals backed by evidence. Collectors shifted their passions from powders to papyrus, from medicine to archaeology. What had once been swallowed was now studied. The transformation was less redemption than reinvention, Europe repackaging its obsession with Egypt into a narrative of discovery rather than desecration. But the truth could not be erased entirely. Stories lingered, rumors passed down, and later historians pieced the puzzle together. The grotesque details emerged like bones from sand: the banquets, the pigments, the powders, the counterfeit corpses. Each revelation deepened the sense of horror, not only at what was done, but at how ordinary it had seemed. Civilization, it turned out, had feasted in the dark without noticing the blood on its lips. And so the mummy craze remains one of history's strangest mirrors. It reflects not only Europe's fear of death, but its hunger for control, its willingness to consume the sacred for the sake of survival. The tale is not about monsters, but about people, ordinary, learned, desperate, who believed they had found a cure in the dust of the dead. Their mistake is our inheritance, a reminder that knowledge without humility can devour the very history it seeks to preserve. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe's appetite for mummy flesh had largely died, but the scars of that hunger remained. Egypt's necropolises were stripped bare, countless dynasties erased not by conquest but by consumption. What once lay in solemn silence beneath stone now whispered only through fragments scattered across Europe, housed in glass cases or painted onto canvases. The absence itself became a monument to the madness of centuries. For archaeologists, the work was bittersweet. Each intact mummy unearthed was a victory, a chance to glimpse an ancient life spared from the banquet tables of Europe. Yet each intact body also sharpened the grief for those lost. Scholars knew that for every preserved pharaoh, dozens had been ground into medicine or mixed into paint. They walked through tombs as mourners as much as explorers, conscious of history stolen and unrecoverable. Writers of the era transformed the guilt into myth. Tales of the mummy's curse gained popularity, warning of vengeance from the dead disturbed. Audiences thrilled to the idea of ancient spirits punishing grave robbers. Though the real curse was already plain, Europe had cursed itself by desecrating its own conscience. The stories were projections of unease, a way to dramatize guilt as superstition rather than confess it as fact. Meanwhile, museums became new temples. Visitors flocked to see what their ancestors had once consumed. children pressed noses to glass, staring wide-eyed at the desiccated faces. Guides spoke of dynasties and gods, carefully avoiding mention of the centuries when those same bodies had been swallowed like bread. The museum preserved the dead, but also preserved the silence, the great omission of history retold without its darkest chapter. Artists, too, faced their complicity. Some confessed to having used mummy brown recoiling when they learned its true source. Others defended it as tradition, unwilling to see their canvases stained with horror. The pigment slowly disappeared, yet traces linger still in galleries. Visitors admire the depth of a portrait, unaware that its warmth may have come from powdered bone. The art world, like medicine, carried the ghost of consumption long after the practice ended. By the 20th century, mummy eating was spoken of with disbelief, as though it were legend rather than fact. Historians dug into archives and proved otherwise, laying bare receipts, prescriptions, and diaries that confirmed the truth. The shock was not only at the act itself, but at how long it endured, embraced by kings, physicians, and ordinary households alike. Civilization had dined on corpses and had done so proudly. The lesson resonates with uncomfortable clarity. Human beings, when desperate, will justify almost anything. Wrapped in authority and tradition, even the grotesque becomes ordinary. The mummy trade is not only a cautionary tale about medicine, it is a reminder of the thin veil that separates progress from barbarism. One century's cure becomes the next century's crime. Today, mummies rest in climate-controlled rooms, their preservation guarded by science rather than plunder. Signs warn visitors not to touch barriers, keep the curious at a distance. The irony is sharp. Once consumed as cure, they are now revered as irreplaceable treasures. Yet reverence cannot undo consumption. The lost bodies will never return, their voices silenced forever, their names lost in the dust of European apothecaries. As you stand before a glass case in a museum staring at the still face of someone embalmed 3,000 years ago, you are staring at a survivor. A survivor not only of time, but of Europe's appetite. Behind the silence lies an unspoken question: how many of his kin were swallowed, erased, forgotten? That question lingers in the air, heavier than incense, heavier than history itself. And so we close this chapter not with judgment, but with warning. The Europeans who ate mummies were not monsters. They were people blinded by fear, misled by authority, seduced by fashion. Their story is our story, a testament to how easily humanity can lose its way when it confuses knowledge with wisdom. The next time you hear of a miracle cure, a trend too good to doubt, remember the taste of dust, the banquet of the dead. And remember, above all, the true horror of history is not what they did then, but what we are still capable of now.